The needle was still in his arm when they found him. Not a weapon, not a threat. A thin medical catheter taped to the inside of his elbow with the particular care of someone who had done it many times before in the dark, alone, without assistance. The Verlian scout who discovered the human had no reference for what it meant. She catalogued it the way her training demanded. Unknown object, biological interface, purpose unclear. She filed the image. She moved on. She would think about that needle for the rest of her life. The formal declaration arrived at 400 hours, galactic standard, transmitted simultaneously to every human communication array within 11 light-years. The Galactic Accord, a coalition of 31 sovereign species, representing what they described as the civilized portion of the known galaxy, had reached a unanimous decision. Humanity's continued expansion beyond the boundary markers established by the Tessarine Accords of 2.7 millennia prior constituted an act of territorial aggression. The response would be proportional. The response would be immediate. The response would, the Accord assured itself, be brief. They were not wrong about proportional. They were catastrophically wrong about brief. Supreme Executor Vraithsal of the Verlian Dominion read the initial engagement projections with the particular satisfaction of someone who has already written the ending of a story before reading its middle chapters. Humanity, as a spacefaring civilization, was approximately 400 years old. The youngest member of the Galactic Accord was 900. The oldest, the Tessarine themselves, had been navigating stellar distances before the first anatomically modern human had looked up at a night sky and wondered. The mathematics were clean. The models were reliable. The confidence interval on total human capitulation was listed at 94.7% within 18 galactic standard months. Someone had written that number. Someone had signed their name to it. That number would eventually become the most studied document in the history of the Accord's Intelligence Bureau, not for its conclusions, but for everything it had failed to account for. Executor, his adjutant, a young Verlian named Sereth Vin, entered without the usual request and acknowledgement protocol. That alone told Vraithsal something was wrong. We have an anomaly in the first contact intercepts. The humans received the declaration. Expected. They responded within 4 minutes. Vraithsal looked up. 4 minutes was fast, fast enough that they could not have convened a leadership council, fast enough that whatever they sent back had not been deliberated. What did they say? Sereth Vin set the translation on his desk. Vraithsal read it. Read it again. This is the complete transmission. Word for word. The message contained no legal counterargument, no request for negotiation, no expression of fear, which the Accord's psychological models had rated as near certain. It contained 4 sentences. The last of them was a human idiom that the translation software had flagged as culturally untranslatable. With a footnote explaining it was a phrase used historically by humans facing overwhelming odds, something to do with the weather, and the fact that they would not be the ones concerned about it. Vraithsal set down the document. That was the first mystery. Not that the humans had responded with defiance. Defiance was a known variable, a predictable stage in the capitulation model. The mystery was what had not been in the message. No fear, no bargaining, no acknowledgement of the power differential that should have been, mathematically, impossible to ignore. Either the humans did not understand what they were facing, or they understood something the Accord did not. The second mystery surfaced 6 days later, and it came wearing the shape of a supply manifest. Commander Idris Vale, that was the name attached to the human military unit that Verlian forward scouts had been tracking across the Crescent Belt, had requisitioned something that made no tactical sense. Not weapons, not reinforced shielding, not fuel converters or jump drive components. Medical equipment. Specifically, approximately 47 days' worth of advanced trauma surgical supplies, enough blood-clotting accelerant to treat roughly 300 critical injuries. And here the manifest grew strange, a category of pharmaceutical the Translation Bureau initially had no reference for. It took 2 days to identify. The humans called it, in their own language, something like the thing that makes pain into a distant sound. The closest Verlian equivalent was a compound used in their own military field hospitals, but they used it sparingly because it had cognitive side effects: impaired judgment, reduced tactical decision-making speed. Humans, apparently, used it routinely. The Accord's military analysts flagged this as evidence of a significant vulnerability. Humans needed that much pain management because they broke easily. Their bodies were fragile. It confirmed a hypothesis several senior analysts had already been quietly working from. They filed it under biological limitation exploitable. They moved on. They were wrong in a way that would take them months to understand. Idris Vale had been a surgeon before the war. This was not a metaphor. He had spent 11 years in a trauma bay on a station orbiting Europa, where the work was constant and the margin for error was technically zero, and in practice slightly worse than that. He had a particular habit, developed somewhere in year 3, of narrating his own actions in a low murmur while he worked, not for the benefit of anyone listening, but because the sound of a calm voice helped him stay inside the task when everything around him was the opposite of calm. He did this now, in the gutted cargo bay of what had once been a civilian transport vessel, and was now functioning as the field headquarters for the 7th Crescent Defense Group, as he fitted the catheter into the inside of his own elbow. Continuous saline, lidocaine diluted to 12%, and something that's going to make the next 18 hours significantly more manageable, he murmured. And before you ask. I wasn't going to ask, said Lieutenant Yara Moss from the doorway. She was leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, watching him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she disagreed with him, but had decided not to say so directly. You were thinking it. I was thinking that the Accord's forward line is 6 hours out, and our jump relay is still offline, and you're sitting there doing surgery on yourself. Minor distinction, I'm doing anesthesia on myself. Surgery would require a second set of hands. He pressed the tape down carefully. The relay will be online in 3 hours. Chen's team is on it. Chen's team is 4 people with 2 functioning cutting torches. That's enough, he looked up at her. How many in the Eastern Quadrant? The question landed between them with a weight that had nothing to do with tactics. Yara uncrossed her arms. 62 confirmed. Maybe another 20 we haven't reached yet. 62 wounded, 20 missing. The unit had started with 214. Idris nodded once, the way he had learned to receive numbers that should have broken something in him and didn't, not because he was numb, but because the part of him that would need to break later had agreed to wait. Tell Chen I need that relay. What are you going to do with it when you have it? He picked up a second piece of tape, smoothed it down over the catheter's edge with the same unhurried care he had used for the first. Call home, he said. The relay came online in 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was faster than he had expected from 4 people and 2 torches, and which told him something about the people that the torches already knew. The signal he sent was not a battle report. It was not a tactical update. It was, technically, classified under a category the Accord's intelligence division had never successfully decoded because the category did not exist in any military communication framework they had studied. The humans called it a personnel status transmission, which translated accurately but explained nothing. It was a list of names. Each name had a status. The statuses were not active, injured, or killed in action. They were more specific than that, and the specificity was the part that didn't translate. One of the Accord's signal intercept analysts, a meticulous Tessarine named Orvith Kahl, who had spent 30 years studying human communication patterns, spent 6 hours trying to understand what the status notations meant. Some appeared to be medical terms. Some appeared to be something else entirely. One notation, repeated 17 times, translated most closely to holding. Holding what? Holding where? Orvithkal could not determine this. She flagged the transmission and sent it up the chain with a note that read, in her careful Tessarine syntax, "This is not a military document. I do not know what it is." The chain did not know what to do with that. The chain forwarded it to the Psychological Analysis Division, where it sat for 11 days before anyone opened it. By then, a great deal had already happened. Here was what the Accords models had not accounted for, and this was the third mystery, the one that would not announce itself but would accumulate quietly until it became impossible to ignore. Humans did not process threat the way any other species in the Accord did. Every other species in the known galaxy had, through one evolutionary path or another, developed a clear hierarchy of responses to existential danger. At the top of the hierarchy was flight, removal of oneself and one's genetic line from danger. Below that, fight, a calculated response scaled to realistic probability of success. Below that, a variety of complex social and political mechanisms for negotiation, capitulation, and reintegration. These were logical responses. They had been refined over millions of years. They worked. Humans had all of these responses. They also had something else, something that did not appear in the models, because the models had been built from the behavior of species that used their survival instincts rationally. The Accord would learn to call it many things over the following months. In their initial reports, they called it aberrant perseverance. Later, irrationality bias. Later still, after they had more data, they stopped using clinical language for it and started using something closer to the words they reserved for things they did not entirely understand and were not entirely comfortable with. The humans had a word for it too. Several, actually, in dozens of languages. But the one that kept appearing in intercepted communications, in messages between soldiers, in personal logs, in the briefings Idris Vale gave to what remained of the 7th, was a single, short, ordinary word that meant almost nothing on its surface and everything underneath. Yet, as in not defeated yet, not done yet, not out of options yet, not finished yet. The word that meant, I am still counting. They're not retreating, Sarathvin said. His voice had acquired a quality Vraithsal had not heard from him before, not alarm, exactly, but the precursor to it. The careful flatness of a mind trying to keep up with data that keeps arriving faster than interpretation. The battle for the Crescent Belt's outer markers had been ongoing for 11 days. Accord projections had estimated human resistance at the outer markers would last approximately 72 hours before collapse and withdrawal. That estimate had passed. Then the revised estimate of 96 hours had passed. Then the second revision. They've taken 60% casualties in that sector, Vraithsal said. He was not asking. He had the same data his adjutant did. He was saying it out loud because sometimes, in his experience, the act of saying a number aloud forced it to reveal what remained hidden when it was merely read. Yes, Executor. 60% casualties. That's not a fighting force. That's, by every doctrine we have, by every model, that is the definition of a broken unit. Yes, Executor. And they're not retreating. No, Executor, there. Sarathvin paused. Vraithsal had never seen him pause for a word before. They're reorganizing, around the wounded. The ones who can still function are forming perimeters around the ones who can't. They're not evacuating the wounded. They're building toward them. Vraithsal was quiet for a moment. That's not a tactical decision. No, sir, it doesn't appear to be. What does it appear to be? Another pause, longer this time. I'm not certain the word exists in our language, Sarathvin said finally, at least not in a military context. The misinterpretation crystallized on day 14. Accord Tactical Command, watching the human unit in the Crescent Belt continue to hold a position that should have been untenable, reached the most logical conclusion available to them. The humans had a tactical advantage they had not yet revealed. A weapon system, perhaps. A hidden reinforcement line. Something that made the position worth holding at such catastrophic cost. The Accord shifted its approach accordingly. They became cautious. They began probing rather than pressing. They allocated additional intelligence resources to the sector, looking for the hidden advantage. They found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. Idris Vale was holding that position because 62 people were in that position and could not yet be moved, and he had decided, in the practical and entirely unstrategic way that surgeons sometimes decide things, that they were not going to be left behind. He had not run a tactical calculation. He had made a choice. The distinction to a military analyst was invisible. To the people inside that perimeter, it was the only thing that was real. On day 17, something happened that would later be designated in Accord records as the first confirmed instance of Category 7 behavioral anomaly. A category they created specifically because no existing category was sufficient. The relay that had been repaired by Chen's team of 4 with 2 torches went down again, destroyed in an artillery exchange. Accord intelligence, monitoring the sector's communications, noted the silence. A broken relay meant the human unit was isolated. An isolated unit with 60% casualties, no resupply, and no communication was, by every doctrine in existence, a unit that would surrender. The Accord commander in the sector, a Verlian named Vethkaras, transmitted a formal offer of surrender terms. It was generous. As these things went, guaranteed medical treatment for wounded, guaranteed transport to a neutral station, guaranteed release upon cessation of hostilities. He received a response in 40 minutes. Not through the relay, which was destroyed. The humans had rerouted through an emergency signal band that the Accord had not known they were using. A frequency so old and low-powered it predated most of the Accord's scanning infrastructure by about a century, and therefore had not been included in the intercept network. The response was audio only. A human voice, calm, slightly hoarse, with a quality in it that the Accord's xenopsychology division, when they later listened to the recording, would spend considerable time trying to name. It was not bravado. It was not anger. It was something quieter than either of those and more durable. "Tell your commander we appreciate the offer," the voice said. "We have 62 people who aren't ready to travel. We'll keep that frequency open if you want to talk." Vethkaras listened to this message 3 times. Then he called Vraithsal. "They turned down the surrender," he said. "I gathered that. They said their wounded aren't ready to travel." A silence. "The wounded are the reason they should surrender." "That's what I thought," Vethkaras said. "Executor, I want to revisit the intelligence assessment, because either we're missing something large or—" he stopped. "Or what, Commander?" "Or they actually aren't going to stop, not because they think they can win, because they—" His voice had the same quality Sarath Vins had held, the flatness of a mind straining at the edge of its framework. "I don't have a word for it in our language, Executor. I've been trying to find one for 3 days." Here was the moment the Accord's intelligence picture changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way that foundation stones shift before the building above them registers anything at all. Orvith Call, the Tessarine signals analyst who had been sitting with Idris Vale's personnel status transmission for 11 days, finally opened it. She worked through it methodically, the way she worked through everything, cross-referencing the status notations against every human communication database the Accord had compiled. She found the pattern at 200 hours, galactic standard, with no one else in the room. The notations were medical. She had been right about that, but they were not assessments of physical condition. They were something harder to categorize, something that, when she finally isolated the cultural framework they came from, made her sit very still for a very long time. The humans were tracking psychological state. Each name on the list had a notation that indicated in their taxonomy not how badly a person was physically injured, but how far they were from something the cultural database called the edge. The edge of what was not defined in any single document, but from context, and Orvithkal was very good at context. It seemed to mean the point past which a human would cease to function, not because of physical damage, but because of something the Accord had no clinical category for. Holding meant far from the edge, still intact, still counting. She read through the list again, 62 notations, 17 of them said holding. She sent the analysis up the chain, with a note that was uncharacteristically short for someone of her precision and verbosity. The note said, "I believe we have fundamentally misunderstood what we are measuring." The chain this time opened it within hours. And this was the moment, the pivot hidden inside a document, inside a signals archive, inside a bureaucratic process that had been moving at its usual glacial pace, when the Accord's collective understanding of the conflict silently cracked along a fault line no one had thought to map. They had been measuring human resilience. They had been measuring force strength, casualty rates, supply capacity, tactical positioning, all of it accurate, all of it, it turned out, measuring the wrong thing. The thing they should have been measuring had no entry in their strategic assessment frameworks, because no species they had ever encountered had required them to measure it. They should have been measuring how much the humans were willing to hurt before they changed course. The answer, it was becoming apparent, was more than the models had room for. "How are the hands?" Yara Moss asked. Idris looked down. He had been doing a procedure for 3 hours using instruments that were 2 sizes too large for the work and a light source that kept flickering. His hands were steady. This was not a remarkable fact about him. It was a trained response, the product of 11 years of work in conditions that kept getting worse and kept requiring the same precision regardless. "Fine," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer that lets you sleep." She looked at him for a moment. She was carrying a water canteen. She had walked it across the cargo bay specifically for him, which meant she had noticed he hadn't stopped in 3 hours, which meant she had been watching, which meant she was doing the thing she always did, the thing that drove him slightly insane and which he had never once asked her to stop doing. "The relay's back up," she said. "Second one, Chen's team." He finished what he was doing, set down the instrument and accepted the canteen. "Same 4 people. 3, Kowalski's in the east sector. 3 people, 2 torches, a second relay." He drank, handed it back. "Get me the new personnel list when it's compiled." She didn't move. "Idris." Her voice had a different register now, not the tactical Yara, not the Lieutenant Yara, but the one that lived closer to the bone. "We're at 41, from our original count." 41, from 214. He held that number the same way he held all of them, carefully, completely, without putting it down. "I know." The Accord commander sent another surrender offer. "I heard. The terms are better this time. They're offering full medical evac for the wounded within 6 hours." "I heard that too. And you're going to say no?" "I'm going to ask the 41, he said. "Same as last time." Her jaw shifted. "Idris." "Yara," his voice was quiet, not soft exactly, something more weight-bearing than soft. "They asked us last time, you were there, you know what they said." She had been there. She did know. She had been the one who carried the question to each of them, because Idris couldn't leave the surgical bay, and she had come back with the same answer from all 41, including the ones who answered in a whisper, because it was all the volume they had left. She turned and walked back across the bay, without another word. The Accord's second misinterpretation was more costly than the first. Having decided that the human unit's refusal to retreat indicated a hidden strategic asset, and having found no evidence of one, tactical command shifted to a new hypothesis. The humans were buying time for a larger force to arrive. The position they were holding was worthless on its own, but might serve as an anchor point for a broader assault. The Accord, accordingly, repositioned 3 of its heavy cruisers to cover approaches from the outer belt. Those cruisers were not positioned elsewhere. On day 21, a human force entered the Tessarine corridor, not through the outer belt, where the cruisers were waiting, but through a route that the Accord's navigational models rated as impassable for any vessel larger than a light scout. The route was impassable for any vessel with standard structural integrity, and a crew unwilling to sustain significant G-force damage over a 6-hour transit. A human crew, it turned out, had a different definition of significant. The force that came through the Tessarine corridor had 17 ships. 6 of them were badly damaged by the transit. Their crews were, by the medical reports later captured and analyzed, in considerable pain. They were also exactly where no one had predicted they would be. The Accord lost 4 installations in the following 9 hours. They went through the corridor, Vraithsal said flatly. He was looking at the tactical display. He was not, for the first time in Sarathvin's experience, projecting any of the usual commander's certainty. Yes, Executor. That route has a G-force exposure of approximately 14 standard units sustained over 6 hours. Yes, Executor. For context, the Verlian medical threshold for G-force exposure is 6 units before mandatory cessation. What is the human threshold? Sarathvin looked at his data pad. The intelligence files have a range listed. The upper end is theoretical. We haven't had observational data to verify it before now. And the upper end is. They list it as, and I want to be precise here, approximately whatever they decided to tolerate that day. Vraithsal stared at him. That is a direct translation from their own medical documentation, Sarathvin said carefully. Their threshold appears to be contextual. The war was 6 weeks old when Orvithkal requested a direct briefing with the full Accord Council. This was unusual. Signals analysts did not request council briefings. They sent reports. They answered questions when asked. They did not, as a professional culture, initiate contact with the 19 most powerful political figures in the galaxy. She requested it anyway. They gave it to her, partly because of who she was, 30 years of impeccable analysis, and partly because the reports coming from the Crescent sector had created a political climate in which impeccable analysis was suddenly in high demand and low supply. She stood before them for 41 minutes. She presented data. She showed them the personnel status transmissions. She showed them the G-force transit records. She showed them the surrender refusals. She showed them the medical requisitions and explained, now that she understood them, what they actually meant. She walked them through the pattern she had found not in any single document but in the accumulation of all of them. When she finished, the chamber was quiet. The Tessarine elder, the oldest member of the council, who had been alive for longer than the human species had possessed writing, spoke first. "You are saying," the elder said slowly, "that they already know they are losing." "Yes," Orvithkal said. "They have access to the same battlefield data we do, probably more from their internal position. They are fully aware of the force differential. They have always been aware." "Then why?" "Because," she said, and she had thought about how to translate this for days, had turned the words over and over looking for the version that would cross the gap between species without losing what made it real. Because for them, losing is not the decision point. The decision point is something else entirely. She paused. In our frameworks, when a force calculates that it will lose, it begins the process of capitulation. That is rational. That is correct by every logical model we have. But the human framework contains a variable our models do not have a slot for. Which variable? whether they are willing to accept the loss. She let that sit in the chamber for a moment. For every other species in this accord, those two things, knowing you will lose and deciding to stop, occur simultaneously. They are the same step. For humans, they are separate steps. And the second one, she shook her head slightly. The second one appears to have no automatic trigger. Day 43. Idris Vale had 19 people left. The cargo bay that had been their headquarters had been moved twice, rebuilt once, and partially opened to vacuum for 11 hours before a seal held. The catheter in his arm had been replaced 4 times. His hands were still steady. He had stopped narrating his own actions aloud 3 days ago, not because the calm voice had stopped being useful, but because it required breath he was rationing. Yara Moss brought him the newest transmission from the Accord, another surrender offer, the 5th. He read it. The terms were extraordinary: full withdrawal from the Crescent Belt, guaranteed neutral status for human-held systems within 8 light-years, medical care, transport, the terms that 6 weeks ago would have been a victory. He set the transmission down. "They're scared," Yara said, not a question. "They're recalibrating," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about everything, without protecting himself from the answer. "No," he said, "not at this point, not anymore." She sat down across from him. The cargo bay was quiet. 19 people, scattered across 3 rooms, some sleeping, some awake, all of them still by the notation Idris used in his lists, holding. "What do we do?" she asked. "What do the 19 say?" She had already asked. She had learned to ask before he could, which was either adaptation or love, and he had stopped trying to decide which. "They say the same thing they always say." He nodded. "Idris?" Her voice was back at that register, the one closer to the bone. "I need you to tell me, not as my commander, not as the unit's surgeon, as the person who has been keeping a list of everyone who was here. I need you to tell me what you think we're doing." He was quiet for a long moment. "We're telling them what we cost," he said finally. "Every day we're here, we're writing a number into their calculations that they didn't have before, and that number changes what comes after us, for everyone who comes after us." He looked at her. "That's not tactics, it's not heroics, it's just arithmetic." She was very still. "The war doesn't end here," he said. "We know that. But what happens after the war, what they're willing to offer, what they're willing to concede, what they understand about us, that starts here. With how long the number keeps going up." She looked at him for a long time. Then she stood, picked up the transmission, and walked to the signal equipment. "What should I tell them?" she asked. "Tell them we need more time." "More time for what?" "More time," he said. "Just more time. Let them figure out what it means." She sent that message. The Accord Council received it at 900 hours, Galactic Standard, and convened an emergency session that lasted for 6 hours. The session was, technically, about military strategy. In practice, it was about something that had no entry in the Council's procedural frameworks: the experience of being studied by something that did not behave like a prey species. The experience of having extended, repeatedly, a hand that should have ended the thing, and having the thing look at the hand and keep moving. Orvith Kahl was present for the first 2 hours of the session. She left when it became clear that what the Council needed was not more analysis, but more time to sit with the specific quality of discomfort that the data created. The discomfort of discovering that a civilization you had assumed was beneath your notice was watching you with the same calm, unhurried attention that a very experienced surgeon gives to a problem that has not resolved in the expected time frame. She walked back to her office. She opened the personnel status file she had been carrying for 6 weeks. She read through the names again. 62 once, 41, 30, 19. All of them listed as holding. She sat at her desk for a long time. Outside, the Accord was making decisions. Treaties were being reconsidered. Force allocations were being revised. The 94.7% confidence interval on human capitulation was being quietly retired from every document that contained it. None of that was her work. Her work was the file in front of her. Her work was the specific mystery she had been carrying for 6 weeks and had finally, she thought, found the bottom of. She was wrong. There was no bottom. That was the point. The peace terms were announced 61 days after the declaration of war. The Crescent Belt was restored to human jurisdiction. The boundary markers of the Tessarine Accords were renegotiated. Humanity was, for the first time, granted a seat at the Accord Council, not an advisory seat, not an observational status, but a full voting membership that several elder species had privately opposed for centuries on the grounds of humanity's youth, volatility, and what the formal objections had called insufficient civilizational maturity. Those objections had been filed before the war. They were quietly withdrawn afterward by species who had looked at 61 days of data and revised their definition of maturity. Idris Vale was not present for the signing. He was in a medical facility on a neutral station, which was where he had been for the previous 12 days, which was where Yara Moss had told him he was going after the 19th day in the cargo bay, using a tone of voice that he had recognized as the one that did not offer negotiation. He was working on his hands when she came in. Not surgery, exercises, small precise movements against resistance, the kind of maintenance work that keeps precision from degrading after long periods of sustained stress. She sat in the chair by the wall. She looked at him for a while. "They signed," she said. He kept working his hands. "Good terms." "Better than good." She told him the specifics. He listened. "The Crescent Belt," he said. "Yes." "The boundary markers." "Renegotiated in our favor." "Council seat." "Full voting, effective immediately." She paused. "There's something else." Orvith Kahl, the Tessarine analyst who was working our communications. She sent a personal message, not through official channels. She sent it to me, actually. Said she wasn't sure how to address it to you. He stopped moving his hands. What did it say? Yara unfolded a paper, actual paper, which meant she had printed it, which meant she had read it enough times that she wanted the physical version. She read from it. "I have spent 30 years studying communication between species. I have never encountered a species that uses the same word for a military status report and a personal declaration. In our language and in every other language I have studied, those are different documents with different purposes. In your transmission, they were the same thing. I did not understand this for a long time. I believe I understand it now. I am not certain the understanding is comfortable. I thought you should know that it was received." Yara folded the paper. Idris sat with that for a while. "She understood the list," he said. "Sounds like it." What it meant, what holding meant. "Yeah." He looked at his hands. The exercises had kept them functional through 11 years of trauma surgery, and 61 days of a war fought out of a cargo bay with equipment that kept breaking, and a number that kept getting smaller but never reached zero. "Not yet." "Tell her thank you," he said. "Tell her the word she's looking for is," he paused, reconsidered. "Actually, don't tell her. Let her keep looking. She'll find it eventually." He picked up the resistance band again. "It's worth finding on your own." In the years that followed, the Accord commissioned 7 formal studies on the Crescent Belt engagement. Each study reached approximately the same conclusion from a different angle, and each conclusion was accurate, and none of them were the whole answer. Vraith Sal retired. Sarath Vin was promoted. Veth Karas became one of the few Accord commanders to publicly advocate for the expansion of humanity's council role, which was not a popular position in certain circles and which he held without apology. Orvith Kahl wrote one more document, not a report, not an analysis, a paper published in an academic journal titled, "On the Distinction Between Knowing You Will Lose and Deciding to Stop." It became the most widely read document in the history of the Accords xenopsychological literature, and it ended with a paragraph that many readers found comforting and an equal number found deeply unsettling, which Orvithkal considered both responses to be correct. The final paragraph read, "Every civilization that achieves spacefaring status believes, eventually, that it has found the upper boundary of what a species can endure. It builds its models from this belief. It plans from this belief. It negotiates from this belief. The humans have not, to my knowledge, found this boundary in themselves. After 61 days of observation, I do not believe they are looking for it. I believe what they have instead, the thing our models could not quantify, the thing that does not translate cleanly into any language I know, is the simple, unreasonable, persistent decision to still be here, to still be counting, to still be on the other end of the signal, not because they are certain of the outcome, but because the question of the outcome has not yet made them stop asking what comes next." She paused when she wrote that last line. She almost cut it. She left it in, somewhere on a neutral station, in a medical facility that overlooked a view of stars that were technically, by the new treaty, in human-controlled space. A man doing hand exercises read the abstract of her paper, set his phone down, and looked out the window for a while. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He was still counting.